ABC News has agreed to pay $15 million to settle a lawsuit brought by President-elect Donald Trump, alleging that George Stephanopoulos made defamatory statements about Trump on air related to the E. Jean Carroll case. It's a striking decision given how high the bar is to prove defamation. Now, Trump is hinting at his plans to pursue additional lawsuits against media outlets, including the Des Moines Register. Take a look.
I see others. I have a few others that I'm doing. I'm going to, as an example, I'm doing this not because I want to. I'm doing this because I feel I have an obligation to. I'm going to be bringing one against the people in Iowa, their newspaper, which had a very, very good pollster who got me right all the time. And then just before the election, she said I was going to lose by 3 or 4 points, and it became the biggest story all over the world, because I was going to win Iowa by 20 points. The farmers love me, and I love the farmers.
The farmers love him, and it's his obligation to do this. Here to discuss potential implications for press freedom and free speech is Greg Lukianoff, president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions. Welcome, Greg.
Hey, Michael. Business is booming in free speech land.
Business is booming. Woo-hoo. And you don't want it to boom, right? You're in the one business where you really don't want it to boom. Let's talk a little bit about this. I mean, Donald Trump, to the average person here, Donald Trump is threatening to sue the Des Moines Register for commissioning a poll that was wrong, and wrong by quite a bit. What is the argument that he's making here, and what is the sort of implication for free speech?
It's even better than that, Michael. He's suing them under the Consumer Fraud Act, which prohibits deception when advertising or selling merchandise. Oh. So it's not even a law that makes sense. This would be something where it would be commercial speech, and generally polling is considered to be standard reporting. So it's pretty absurd of a claim overall, and we're all kind of like, but I think what ABC did in settling kind of opens the door to this kind of stuff. I think what ABC made a kind of strange decision. I think they were likely to win that case. Now it's not as easy as some other defamation cases, because they can argue, Stephanopoulos said he was liable of rape when he was actually liable of sexual abuse, and so they have at least a little bit of an argument. But as far as the standard for New York Times v. Sullivan defamation, I think the chance of them winning was, maybe 12% tops. And they caved, and we don't really understand entirely why ABC News decided to do that. But then it makes the next thing, absurd lawsuits against, polling that ended up being inaccurate, is the next step.
Greg, you just mentioned something that I think a lot of people who even follow this stuff casually will hear this intimidating phrase, because it's a court case, New York Times v. Sullivan. Give us a sense of what that case is and why that is the thing we hear referenced so much in relation to cases like this, specifically the ones that Donald Trump's threatening.
Yeah, the New York Times v. Sullivan case is an incredibly important case that seems to have haters on both the left and the right. Yeah. And it's utterly mystifying to First Amendment people, because we're like, this protects everyone really well. And it's basically going back to the 1960s, Civil Rights Act. A pro-civil rights organization took out an ad that sort of called out Southern officials for various wrongs. And they did actually get a couple things wrong in the ad. And so the Southern officials sued, but the Supreme Court said that when you're a political official, that essentially the standard has to be very high for you to be able to get away with defamation. So they established something that's now called the actual malice standard, which I think is a terrible name because it doesn't really explain exactly what it means. But essentially, if it's a matter of public concern, and if you're talking about a matter of public concern and it's a defamation suit brought by a public official on behalf of a public official, that you have to show that it was either knowingly false, in other words, a lie, or showed reckless disregard for the truth. That's a tough standard, but it's actually exactly what you want in a situation where people are going to get things slightly wrong here and there. And there was even the Obama administration was saying stuff about New York Times v. Sullivan going too far.
Yeah.
But the right really seems to be taking aim at it.
And so the right is really, I mean, I was Ron DeSantis. I mean,
Yeah.
I sat on a panel with him, and I didn't realize that I was going to be the pro New York Times v. Sullivan guy. But what about that argument that they make that, look, this happened to a guy like Nick Sandmann, who's the young kid from Covington Catholic, who won a case against, I think, both the Washington Post and CNN. And
wasn't it a giant settlement, though? Not exactly.
It was a giant settlement, but they, I mean, obviously are settling because they know this is not going to go well for them in some way, either publicity or legally. And so the argument from people like that is like, okay, he's not a public figure in the same sense that a politician is or someone who's a Hollywood star. I mean, the argument being that maybe it just makes people more careful because the press right now is too willing to go after people and defame them because they're protected by this Supreme Court precedent. What is wrong with that argument that you hear from a lot of people on the right these days?
Yeah, I think that essentially, it's not even really sort of in their own interest. The extent to which, the sort of right-wing blogosphere and the right-wing media relies on New York Times v. Sullivan. Like they would be some of the first, victims of it. But there's something more profound going here. It really does matter that Sandmann was a private figure, and we do analyze cases involving private figures, even if it's a matter of public concern, at a slightly more deferential standard. But when you actually create a situation in which the president himself can sue you for getting a story slightly wrong successfully, that's vast power to punish the press, and it's something that exists in other countries, by the way, and it's disastrous. There's a reason why like every dictator in the world likes to sue from Britain, because Britain has they've improved them slightly over the past 10 years, but it used to be that truth wasn't even a defense in Britain. The old saying was, the greater the truth, the greater the libel, and it creates a situation in which the news media has to be will actually not cover certain topics or publish certain books because it says things that might even be true. But will get you sued by, Saudi.
In certain books that cannot and will not be published by publishers that have an office, say, in the UK. I mean, we've seen with academic publishers that publish something in the US and won't publish it in the UK. Explain one thing to me. These terms are so hard to decipher as a layman. What is a public person? I mean, if you have a show on YouTube that's moderately successful, does that mean you're a public person, or is it, is there some very rigid standard that the court has created? Because I get the idea that, you can't just go around suing people as politicians. It'd be a total nightmare. But as a private person or somebody who is not in that position, being defamed and being called all these names, you get the thing there. But so how does one judge that?
Well, it's really easy for some people, like essentially, like if you're a public official, which is how New York Times v. Sullivan started out. Like if you're a representative of the state, then it's just you're treated as a public official. It then kind of expanded into what we would simply call celebrities. And for some celebrities, it's easiest. And there's even something called an all-purpose public figure, and that would be I'm older, so that would be like Oprah, for us, like someone who basically is kind of like considered almost part of everyone's everyday life, where they have very little. They're obviously a public figure. It gets trickier when you get to people who get pulled into cases that become big deals and kind of become celebrities out of that. Now, there's even a name for that, which at least in this case sounds like what it means, which is a vortex public figure. That essentially, like when there's a big firestorm around something, you get pulled in. You could then be considered a vortex public figure. It does get tricky and confusing in an age where everybody is unfortunately actually famous for 15 minutes due to social media. So that part can be a bit more of a mess than it used to be.
Donald Trump has threatened not just the Des Moines Register for a dodgy poll, but threatened a number of people who have come after him and said, if you were peddling the Russiagate hoax, to quote him, that you might be in his crosshairs or in the legal crosshairs. a lot of people get sort of panicked about Donald Trump and the things that he says. Is there something to panic about, or is it so that the courts are independent and robust and we have precedent? So this is maybe a tactic to threaten people, which, by the way, I will say is bad, because you have to expend money to defend yourself in this way. This is lawfare of a different way. But are we in a position here where that actually won't chill speech in a legal way, because the courts will just toss all this stuff out and say, First Amendment rules, buddy, this is not going to happen?
Well, if ABC didn't back down, I'd feel more confident about that. But in this case, ABC, and I'm not like, I'm really kind of racking my brain about why it decided not to fight a suit that was probably going to win. And I think there are two possibilities. Once they went into discovery, they might have discovered some things that actually make ABC look really bad.
Explain that to people who might not know. Discovery is when they get to kind of go through your emails and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, and take depositions and find out if there was evidence of like extreme bias, for example, and even if it's not something that ends up winning you or losing you the lawsuit, you could still look really bad. So maybe they were afraid of that. There was just a Wall Street Journal article that came out right before I read this, though. Apparently, the order came down from Bob Iger himself at Disney, saying that we're going to take the settlement. So it could be as simple as like not wanting to be in an ongoing fight with the new administration, and that is a little scary, because basically, like if you're afraid that the president is going to be vindictive towards your organization constantly, and that causes you to settle a defamation lawsuit that you otherwise would win, and it kind of puts everyone else on notice that claims that we used to think were frivolous are now going to be taken a lot more seriously, that does create a potential big chilling effect.
And there's nothing to potentially stop the president, if he is feeling especially vindictive, of just sort of lodging these cases and losing, provided he, gets the message across in a kind of mafioso type way that you better be careful what you write about me, right? I mean, there's no restraints on that.
Well, I mean, one of the things is there's something that First Amendment lawyers love that nobody else really cares about, but they're called SLAPP legislation, that basically is strategic lawsuit against public participation, that creates sort of an abbreviated process for if you're truly launching a frivolous lawsuit that affects freedom of speech, that it can be very much more quickly dismissed than almost anything else. Not every state in the union has this, and I haven't really seen it. It's usually applied to corporations or rich folk, going after the little guy. How it actually applies to government, I've seen a couple cases where SLAPP lawsuits have come in. But I do think this is a great argument for more states in the union passing SLAPP lawsuits. SLAPP legislation, anti-SLAPP legislation.
Final question for you, Greg.
Yes.
I mean, look, I care a lot about free speech. I've written a lot about it.
It's a tough opening there, Michael.
This is when I confess that I no longer do. But no, I see people who have been on my side on these issues, on free speech issues, kind of shrinking from some of these sort of more partisan debates and recent debates. When a lot of this stuff comes from the right. I mean, people have been expecting it from the left because, university campuses tend to be places where progressives and people on the left thrive and kind of control the processes. And so there's been a lot of fight about that. Do we have a kind of old ACLU-like mentality now where people are like, you know what, this guy might be on our side, but this is a threat to free speech? Or are you seeing this become much more of a partisan issue?
Much more of a partisan issue. I'd say probably my biggest sort of national trend concern is that those of us who defend free speech for all sides, and consistently do, and have the daily hate mail to prove it, we don't have a clear constituency either on the right and the left. Both the right and the left used to have at least a sort of more libertarian wing that tended to be more sort of reliable on free speech. And now we're in a weird situation where the best defenders, if you look at polling of free speech, are often center right and center left. But relying on the center to be the people most defending freedom of speech can be a little precarious, because sometimes the center, they don't want to defend the extremes. So I think I think the age of there being what I call a cult of free speech, which I thought of as a very good thing, or essentially it was just taken to be an almost sacred good, has largely come to an end, and we're in hyper partisan, scary territory, and we need more people who believe in freedom of speech for its own sake to raise their hands. Come work with us on these kind of cases. And I want them to do it out of something more than self-interest, because, yes, you will regret free speech when it's gone. The public will regret if New York Times v. Sullivan gets overturned. But there's something higher than that. That essentially, we consider freedom of speech a human right. And also, very simply, my philosophy on it, it's really important to know what people really think. And if you create an environment where people are constantly self-censoring, just like they are on campus, it distorts everything.
Yeah, I always object to this verb platforming, which in journalism we used to call interviewing. And they say, well, you can't platform this person. Well, somebody platformed them long enough for you to know that you don't want to platform them. Yeah. So speech is important. Greg Lukianoff, the man at the helm of FIRE, one of my favorite organizations. I will show my bias right now. Greg, thanks for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.
Great seeing you, Michael. Take care.